everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's tutorial, we'll paint this sweet and simple watercolor flower with some flowing leaves and greenery. This is one of my all-time favorite beginner-friendly compositions to paint, and I think you'll enjoy it too. So let's get started. And just a reminder before we get started, all of the supplies I'm using in this video are linked down below in the description box if you'd like to check them out, along with links to all of my online painting classes. Alright, so let's get started painting the flower. So I'm going to start by taking my size 5 brush. It's a Princeton Velvet Touch brush, and I'll start loading up a very heavily pigmented mixture of this permanent alizarin crimson. And you really want to start heavily pigmented for this first step, so make sure you load up quite a bit. And you also want to make sure that that mixture has a good amount of water in it too, because whatever we put down for these first few strokes, that's what we're going to be pulling all of the color from. So don't be afraid of having a good amount of water and paint. And I'll just use the tip of my brush to apply some dots down on the paper in a circle. And this will be the center of our flower. They don't have to be perfect, you don't want it to be completely uniform, but you do want a good amount of pigment on there to pull from. And once you have that down, you can switch to a larger brush. If you want smaller petals, you can stay with the smaller brush, but I really like those big fluffy petals, so I'm going to be using a size 10 in the Princeton Neptune brush. If you've watched any of my videos, you know how much I love these Neptune brushes for these types of florals. And what I'm going to be doing is using the very tip of my brush to pull out some color that will then be the color of the petals. So you can watch me first and then paint along. So pulling out some color and then just letting my brush expand out onto the page. I'm going to do 2 of these to create the petal. And you can see a really beautiful petal form there. And my brush was just filled with water. It didn't have any pigment on it, but what you're doing is pulling the pigment from the middle. And that's why it's so important to have very heavily pigmented brush marks in the middle. So I'm going to do that again here using the tip of my brush to pull out and then putting a lot of pressure down to create these big fluffy petals. And your petals don't have to be exactly the same. I love the look of having imperfect petals, different shapes. You can see this one's kind of curving slightly downward, so don't feel like you need to make the perfect petal shape every single time. Just make sure to really push your brush down so that the belly of the brush is expanding out to create those really beautiful petals. And I'm also rinsing off my brush every time I do this, because if I don't rinse out my brush, I'd start to get a little too much pigment, and the rest of the petals will get progressively darker and darker, but I want to keep them nice and light. So just making sure to rinse off my brush. Again, pulling out some color from the center and really putting a lot of pressure down to create that petal. And if you want thinner, finer looking petals, you can just do 1 stroke per petal, or you can pull it out longer and have them longer. I just personally like these really loose, fluffy petals. So that's what I like to do, but feel free to make it your own and experiment with different amounts of pressure on your brush. And I'll round out this last petal here, pulling out the color from the center and then really expanding out. And then you can see this really beautiful flower start to form. And now we can start on the leaves and the filler flowers. So for my leaves, I'm going to use a size 4 script brush, and script brushes are a little bit longer and thinner than traditional round brushes, but a round brush will also work perfectly fine. Now what I'm going to do is I've loaded up my green mixture, and I typically like to use a mixture of sap green, deep sap green, indigo. Sometimes I add a little bit of brown in there. I just have my palette full of different shades of green that I just kind of mix all together. And I load it up in my brush, and I'm going to add some leaves coming out on either side of the flower. So I do have a whole other YouTube video, I'll link it here, that teaches you a bunch of different ways to paint leaves. And so you'll see in that video, I like to teach my leaves doing light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. And that's starting with the tip of your brush, applying more pressure down so the bristles expand, and then lifting back up to create a really beautiful leaf shape. So that's what we'll be doing. So starting with the tip of my brush, I have plenty of green in my mixture. I'm going to use the very tip, create a very nice thin stem, and then apply some pressure down to create the leaf. And then I'll do that same thing, light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure, to connect the leaf there. And that's what I'll be doing to add a few different leaves coming off of this stem. So light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure, and again, light, heavy, light. And I really want you to express your creative freedom here, so don't feel like you have to make the exact same strokes that I'm doing. But just go ahead and add some little wispy leaves coming off of this stem. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you add your leaves is I'm actually going to add a couple more little filler flowers in between them. So make sure you leave at least just a little bit of white space in between your leaves. And I'll add my last little leaf here, and I want to give this some more movement, so I'm going to have this leaf kind of pulling downward. Give it a little bit of a curve. Light, heavy, light. And now I personally like to also just add a couple of little wispy sprigs here. But again, I don't want to go overboard because I will be adding some more little florals in between them. And I'm going to go ahead and do that same exact thing on the other side. Just making sure I have plenty of green paint loaded up into my brush. You're welcome to use any greens you'd like. I'll have my favorite ones linked down below. And I'm going to have this one coming out of here and giving a little bit more of a curve to it. Applying more pressure for the main part of the leaf and lifting back up to create a fine tip. And doing the same exact technique, just adding a few leaves here and there on this stem, making sure that you give each leaf some movement. You don't just want a straight line with straight leaves, because that wouldn't look very realistic. You want to add some movement and just a little bit more of a dynamic interest to your piece. Now, before I go in and add the fillers, I'm just going to add a couple more leaves coming off in between some of these petals. So I'm not going to do a full stem again, but just a couple of little leaves. And that'll help balance out the piece. All right, so once you're happy with how your leaves are looking, we can go ahead and add the final little flowers. So I'm going to zoom you in so you can see a little bit better here. And I'm back down to my size 5 brush for this part. And this is a really easy way that I like to add some little dainty buds or filler florals to my pieces. So I have heavily pigmented mixture, the same color that I used on the primary flower, which is Permanent Alizarin Crimson. It's from Daniel Smith, and I'm just going to make teensy little brush marks here. It's not even in a particular shape, it's just a little bud. And I'm going to do that same thing in between a couple of leaves. And I want to work fairly quickly here because I want these to remain wet so that I can go and blend them out a little bit. So now I'm going to rinse off my brush completely. So I just have nice clean bristles. I want to tap any excess water off on my paper towel. I don't want too much water. And I'm just going to gently soften these out a little bit. So just taking my brush, lining the outer edge, you can start to see that really beautiful soft effect that it creates. And I'm going to rinse off my brush before moving on to the next one. Again, I want to make sure I always have nice and clean water every time I do this. Again, just lining the outer edge, rinsing off any additional pigment, and softly lining that outer edge. And it just creates these really beautiful, dainty little flowers. It doesn't take too much effort, but it really adds a lot to your piece. So again, just lining that edge, being very careful, always making sure I have a very clean brush. And there we go. And then I'll go back to my script brush. I'm going to take a slightly darker value of green and use the very tip just to connect these little buds to the main stem. So keeping a light hand, I'm not applying too much pressure, and gently connecting them. So you can see it's just such a simple little step, but it really adds a lot to the overall composition. So now let's go ahead and add it to the other side. And again, you're more than welcome to add as many as you'd like. If you just want a couple, you can have a couple. If you want to have multiple on a stem, you can add multiple. Just feel free to express your creativity here and go crazy if you'd like, or keep it nice and simple. So again, starting by just using the tip of my small brush, I'm barely adding any brush marks down here. You don't want it to be anything that's distracting from your main flower. I still want that to be the showcase element, but I just want to add a little something something here. So just keeping my brush marks nice and light and dainty. And again, you don't want it to look completely uniform. You don't want identical buds on either side. So just make sure to mix it up, rinse off your brush, make sure you have completely clean bristles, not too much water, and start to gently feather it out. Just barely touching that outer edge, and you get those really beautiful gradients. And I'll continue doing this on the final 3 little buds. All right, and there you have it. Like I said, it is a super simple painting, and it's one that I always like to teach beginners first because it really helps you practice a lot of those foundational watercolor skills. You end up with a really beautiful painting, and best of all, it's a pretty simple process. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing to my channel and giving this video a thumbs up, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.